Secretary Rice, welcome to this series of CDDRL and Novoe Vremya talks, a brilliant mind of Stanford and Silicon Valley. We are very happy to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I think we have a very important moment in Ukrainian history and in Ukrainian foreign policy, because the newly elected president has just commenced his position and he's trying to shape up his foreign policy. And this interview, we will try to understand what is your vision on the state of play in foreign policy and the global threats that we have now.
Very good.
And actually, what is your vision, where we stand in terms of the democracy, global politics, and security now?
Well, let me start with Ukraine, because I think it is really a wonderful moment for Ukraine that there has been a peaceful transition from one presidency to another. Ukraine has had a couple of these, but Ukraine has also had several revolutions. And I've said to my Ukrainian colleagues, it's time to now start governing. And hopefully, the last several years have been years of reform and governance, and that will be continued to continue to fight against corruption, to continue to grow the economy, to continue to provide outstanding, excellent educational opportunities for Ukrainian citizens. This is actually the struggle and the issue for every democracy. And so I see the state of democracy as one that is certainly far better than it was 20, 25 years ago. We count many more countries now as democratic. But there have also been some challenges, and there have been some reversals. And we have to ask, why have those reversals taken place? And they're almost always related to problems in governance. So those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democracies have to pay very great attention to how we are providing for our people and for their greatest aspirations and their greatest needs.
What do you see as the biggest threats to global security now in the current world?
Global security, we have new threats that we wouldn't have imagined several years ago. Of course, we continue to worry about the threats of terrorism. We worry now perhaps more than we did a few years ago about rivalries between great powers. So the rise of China, a Russia that has been more assertive, more aggressive, even though in many ways it is a declining power if one looks at its economic means. We also have new threats like cyber threats, and the ability to use cyber in hybrid warfare with people who are able to manipulate now attitudes and fissures within democratic societies. And so the threats are many. But I believe that we're up to the challenge. I'm not despairing about it. We need to keep the United States involved. We need to keep the United States in a position of leadership. We need to continue to rally the democratic states to take on their responsibilities for this international order that has been so beneficial to all of us. And we need to make sure that young people are as committed to the values of democracy and liberty as former generations were.
I think our program is making a huge impact as to bringing Ukrainians to Stanford and just showing them the best educational experiences they can get in terms of the foreign policy and politics. And let us talk more about US-Ukraine relations. Where do we stand? What is your vision of US-Ukrainian relations at the moment?
There is great support and even sympathy for Ukraine, I think, in the United States in the body politic, because the emergence of an independent Ukraine that is a democratic Ukraine, that is a functioning Ukraine, can have a huge impact on the future of Europe and on the future of America's relations with Europe. I've always thought that given Ukraine's size and weight, given its geographic location, if we want to stop the erosion of democratic values in parts of the world, if we want to counter Russian assertiveness and aggressiveness, then a Ukraine that is functioning well and that is a friend of the United States is going to be a very big part of that. The United States can't do this all on its own. Europe can't do it all on its own. But when I look at what is happening in, for instance, Hungary, or even to a certain extent Poland, where you're having some erosion of the institutions of democratic institutions of governance, to have Ukraine be a solid contributing democracy would make a difference, I think, even to the future of Eastern Europe.
Can I interject a question? I hesitate to call you Secretary, Madam Secretary, since I've known you ever since graduate school.
I think you have to call me Condi, Frank.
So I can call you Condi, but you've met, numerous times with Vladimir Putin. What is he going to do? How far is he going to go? Because we had this incident in the Kerch Strait last winter, and they still have not returned the Ukrainian ships or sailors. Is he just going to keep upping the pressure on Ukraine, and if so, what do we do about that?
I do believe that Vladimir Putin intends to continue to try to make certain parts of Ukraine ungovernable. We all know that he does not mind frozen conflicts. Frozen conflicts actually serve his purposes. And so if you look at the continuing activity in eastern Ukraine, which, by the way, is not getting the press that it once did in our own country, but continues with people continuing to die, with pressures continuing to be put on Ukraine, I think you'll see more of that. I think you'll see incidents like you did with the capture of Ukrainian sailors and the refusal to release. Just pressure. That means that there has to be counter-pressure. And the counter-pressure can take several forms. Fortunately, the sanctions are largely holding, that the United States and Europe collectively were able to put on Russia. I'll return in a moment to the sanctions question. I think it's very important that we have, in terms of NATO, the heavy brigades that are operating in Poland and in the Baltic states. And I think it was a very important step for the Trump administration to arm Ukraine. I believed from the very beginning that if a people want to defend themselves, the United States has an obligation to help them to defend themselves. And Ukrainians can raise the cost to the Russians of what they are doing. And so I'm a very big believer in doing that. I hope that there will be more effort to bring Ukrainian leadership, in terms of military leadership and the like, to the United States, to Europe, to help them become really efficient military leaders who can go back and make the Ukrainian military more efficient, because the first line of defense against Russian aggression has to be Ukraine and Ukrainians. The other thing is that what Ukraine is doing internally to strengthen itself. I used the example, I spoke at a group of Ukrainian students last year in Ukraine. And I used the example of how West Germany dealt with the 40 plus years that it was divided. They could have said, oh, it's terrible, we're divided, we can't get anything done until we get our territory back. But they took a different track. They built a powerful, economically developed, economic engine, strong democracy that was a magnet for the East. And when conditions then were ripe, it was possible for West Germany to completely absorb East Germany. So I know that for Ukraine, the international circumstances are complicated. I know that it's a blow to have lost Crimea. But for now, even under those circumstances, if you build at home, the Russians will have no troubled waters to fish in. And if I could just mention one other point, you have to have a plan for Eastern Ukraine. Part of the problem in places like Donetsk is that these are awful Rust Belt declining places where the populations are pretty desperate. And in those circumstances, the Russians are going to have, we would say, troubled waters to fish in. And so making clear that Eastern Ukrainians are a part of the plan for a vibrant Ukraine, I think will be very important too.
Just to follow up on Frank's question, President Zelensky in his inauguration speech told that ceasefire in Donetsk and Luhansk is his top priority, and he is ready to do anything, including losing his rankings and his position, but without losing Ukrainian territories. Do you believe that President Putin is ready for that, is ready for the ceasefire? Is US ready engaging in Normandy format potentially that also the President Zelensky is thinking of?
I hope that President Zelensky will have this conversation with the Europeans when he takes his first visit to Brussels, meets with the European Union, meets with NATO, and then when he has a chance to meet with President Trump, because this is the right question. Can we get a ceasefire that preserves Ukrainian territory and preserves Ukrainian dignity? I don't know the answer to the question about President Putin. To the degree that Ukraine can start to raise the cost for the Russians, maybe he will tire of making so much trouble in Ukraine. Maybe there is some possibility for a ceasefire. It can't look like Minsk 1. It can't look like Minsk 2. They didn't work. And they perhaps didn't work because the Russians were not yet ready to think about some kind of deal. But if you really do start to raise the cost to the Russians, as we did, for instance, in Afghanistan in the 80s, we raised the cost, and pretty soon they were ready to leave Afghanistan. So I don't think that Putin's ambitions in Ukraine are limitless. His ambitions might be, but his capacity to carry out those ambitions is not limitless. And so I hope that President Zelensky will indeed explore this. But again, the conditions have to be that it preserves Ukrainian territory and it preserves Ukrainian dignity.
You touched upon two very important issues. First one are sanctions, and the second one is military support. And Ukraine now enjoys bipartisan support in Congress, that help us a lot in this both two issues. Do you think we can expect stronger sanctions and more military support?
I would concentrate on the right kind of military support, because the problem with sanctions, more sanctions, is that, first of all, we're running out of things to sanction. That makes sense. I am all for sanctioning Vladimir Putin, his circle, anybody who's been involved in Crimea, all of that. There is, however, a younger, different Russia underneath. These are young people, mostly young people, but some of them just middle-class people who take their children to McDonald's and want to have a better life. For them, life is getting to be pretty difficult under the Putin regime. And when you have complete control of media and complete control of voting, and your popularity still drops down below 60%, something is going on. So we shouldn't alienate all Russians. There are a lot of Russians who want to live in peace with Ukraine, and eventually Ukraine has to live in peace with its Russian neighbor. And so I would hope that we would not start sanctions that are cutting off young people who want to visit the West, young people who want to go to school in the United States or in Europe, young business people in Russia who want to do things the right way, who want to break the 19th century extractive industries economy and diversify toward a more information-based economy. There are young Russians and middle-class Russians who have dreams too. And those dreams are more like Ukrainians' dreams than not. And so I hope that there will be ways to continue to encourage them. And it's one reason that I worry about certain kinds of sanctions.
Now let's talk about the Trump administration in Ukraine. We think that it would be very important for President Zelensky to establish close relations with the Trump administration. Although the question is, if, for example, in Obama administration, we had Vice President Biden, who was known as Ukrainian champion, we don't have one now in the Trump's administration. The other question is, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Mary Yovanovitch, has been recently recalled or called earlier back, so we don't have a U.S. ambassador. What would be your advice now in this situation to President Zelensky team, how to establish closer relations with the Trump administration?
Well, it's a little bit difficult because the administration has had trouble filling certain positions, so the top leadership is spread very thin. But I believe that Secretary Pompeo, I believe that National Security Advisor Bolton, John Bolton worked for me. He would be a fierce defender of Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. I think that you would find that Vice President Pence, who came to Eastern Europe, and that he would be. So I would try to multiply the touch points in the administration and talk to many people, because your point earlier that you have bipartisan support in the Congress is absolutely right. But you do need champions in the administration too, and I do think that they can be mobilized, they can be sustained by making sure that you're touching all of the important people. And I wouldn't worry about the idea that's out there somehow that this is a more pro-Russia than pro-Ukrainian. I just don't believe that. There are people in the administration who want to have better relationship with Russia. That's probably a good thing, even from the point of view of Ukraine. But I would say making sure to touch different parts of the administration is important.
One more very important issue that we have is energy security for Ukraine and the world. Nord Stream 2, you are very well known in the world as an energy security specialist. It's obvious that Nord Stream 2 is not a commercial project. There is no economics behind that. But we still have a lot of European member states pushing for it. What else we can do, or what unconventional steps we may take in order to stop this project?
Well, every American administration, from the first time that this came onto the radar screen, Nord Stream 2, President Bush, as it was just there was some thought about it, to President Obama, to President Trump, has warned against this project. And I don't know what more you can say to the Europeans than why increase your dependency on Russian pipelines, oil and gas. We know from 2006 that the Russians will play the oil card when prices are high. So when I was secretary, the price of oil went to $147 a barrel. And the Russians threatened in 2006 to cut off oil supply. In 2006, they actually cut off gas to Ukraine on New Year's Day. I will never forget it, in January. And so I don't know what more evidence you need that the Russians are playing a political game, not an economic one here. I think you just have to keep talking to the Europeans about it, and you have to start to diversify your own sources and resources so that Ukraine is not so vulnerable to the Russian, looking for other routes. One of the problems now is, with the price of oil relatively low, the other routes are not so economical. And so getting companies to be interested in alternative routes is hard. But this is just a problem that we're going to have to keep working on, and keep trying to get alternatives to Nord Stream 2, and keep telling our European friends that it's a bad idea.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one more issue that you already touched upon, NATO. Yes. You were the one that was pushing a lot for Ukraine's membership. Yes. And Ukraine joining NATO. Yes. And where we stand now, it doesn't look very feasible in the nearest future. What is your vision on Ukraine perspective of membership?
Well, I think for the moment it doesn't look possible. And that is in part because NATO is a consensus organization, and I don't think you would get consensus. I think it would even be difficult right now to get consensus on membership action plan, which is what we tried to do at Bucharest back in 2008. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine can't get closer to NATO, even not even using necessarily the formal arrangements. There is a Ukraine NATO Council that should be maximized as much as possible. Doing things like NATO's work on training of militaries in civil military relations in democratic societies. So there are centers at NATO, Marshall Center and others, that actually invite military officers. Ukraine should be as active, take full advantage of doing that. The NATO has formed a cybersecurity center. And it doesn't have to be all NATO members. There are non-NATO members that are involved in that. Ukraine should be involved with NATO. So I don't think you have to push the formal relationships, which I think are going to be hard in this day and time. But taking as advantage of as many NATO activities as possible, that would be a good place for Ukraine to be.
I'm wondering if you think we have anything to learn from Ukraine, because actually they've been under attack by Russia in the cyber domain for longer than we have.
Yes. I think we have a lot to learn from Ukraine in the sharing of best practices, understanding what it is the Russians did and how they did it. In Ukraine, it's had quite devastating consequences, of course, because it's been married with actual warfare in eastern Ukraine. But I think for all democracies, we have to recognize that what the Russians are doing is just a very much more efficient program of something that Joseph Stalin used to call fifth column politics. So you would identify within countries disaffected populations, and you would appeal to them to be, if not active agents, at least voices for the policies of the Soviet Union. And that's how they did it in the old days. Now with social media, it's much more efficient. You go to disaffected populations, you get them all stirred up around things. You use bot farms and you use fake news to get people stirred up, and you therefore affect even elections. But now we know the playbook. Now we know the playbook. And since we do know the playbook, we have to take steps that the playbook can't work any longer. What worries me is that we're spending so much time now saying how awful it is the Russians did what they did, and not nearly enough time saying how are we going to keep them from doing it again. Because my view is the first time around, shame on them. The second time around, shame on us. We shouldn't allow it to happen. And we know a lot more now about what they did. We should be securing ourselves against that kind of activity.
Now we're coming back to our part of the interview that I love most, which is called short answers or this or that questions.
Yes.
And first one, what is Ukraine in one sentence for you?
Independent.
What are you reading right now?
I'm writing right now, so actually I just finished Frank Fukuyama's book on identity. That's what I'm working with now.
Best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Don't let anything get in the way of your ambitions and your dreams. Only your talent should be a limitation.
Great advice to Ukrainian young generation. What does your perfect morning look like?
My perfect morning is to exercise, and then to practice the piano for several hours, and then to go out and play golf, and then to come back and watch old movies.
A pretty long morning. I'm hesitating to ask when do you wake up?
Just the morning. Well, that's just exercise and practice the piano.
Yeah, I wish you had, like a mornings like that. The White House or Stanford?
Stanford.
Ice skating or treadmill or golf?
Golf.
Thank you, Secretary Rice.
It is a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for doing this. The future of Ukraine, I think, is bright.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.